Audio check. Good morning, and welcome back to Docket 25-1213, application of the Connecticut Light and Power Company, DBA Eversource Energy, for order to securitize 2018 to 2023 catastrophic storm costs. We're back on the record for the third day of evidentiary hearings in this docket. We're on page 4 of the agenda. So after addressing any administrative matters, we'll swear in the revenue requirements and securitization panel, and I will try this time to get the order of cross-examiners correct today. So any administrative matters from anyone?
We have no administrative matters. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else? I see no one else coming to the podium. I have a quick one. I think the case coordinator might have already updated the parties with, once again, my running copy of the LFE and read-in list from the end of the day on, the days are running together, man, Wednesday. Which included late file 21, which was the late file I requested on behalf of Commissioner Smith. I added something to that late file request on that document that wasn't actually addressed on the record yet. So I just wanted clarification. Again, I think the case coordinator already highlighted this, that I added on there requesting specifically which steps of the kind of vendor assignment to vendor payment process are manual versus digital. So I first wanted to kind of make sure, I know there's not the same panel here today, but I want to make sure everyone is okay with that. And also wanted to know Commissioner Smith's here today. So if he wanted to add any clarification or address any questions on that late file, just kind of wanted to raise that.
Thank you, Chairman Wheel. And after 11 weeks, they finally gave me a mic. It's a handheld, so I'm resisting the urge to jump up and sing, which would absolutely ruin our ratings on YouTube. Yes, so thank you for bringing that up. I apologize to everyone. I had to leave early at the last hearing for a slight emergency. The real question was, I was wondering if the company had ever done, and I know that day you had a gentleman who has a process title of some sort, but have you ever done a process mapping of the internal process from when you first contact a contractor or an employee during these events and mapping the process, all the steps straight through to the payment of the invoice at the other end? And the reason I ask is that I spent 15 years at GE back in the Welsh days when we had to do a lot of Six Sigma process improvement, and we found that mapping processes and the steps and the handoffs and with some toll gates and taking out work you didn't need and trying to digitize the whole process and get rid of paper allowed you to reduce errors. And I kind of wonder if you've already started that, if you could share that with us. And over time, it might be something we want to think about because there's so much information that comes in on a docket like this. And if we could somehow digitize and automate it and get it to the point where we trust it, it might reduce the diligence time, it might improve the accuracy, and that sort of thing. So really my question was, have you done that? Do you have a process map? In the current state, how many handoffs are there that are manual? Because that's where errors typically occur. So that's kind of a big, broad question. And then when you're done, I have one other question, if I could. Thank you. Right now, that's okay, because I know it's a different panel.
Thank you. What we'd like to do is be able to respond in late file 21, but that was very clear, and thank you for articulating that in more detail. And we will produce a witness at the late file hearing to respond to any follow-up questions you have once you see the late file response in writing. Thank you.
And from my perspective, it's all about, are there ways we could increase efficiency and make things simpler? And that I'd love to do that in many ways when it comes to how we regulate the utilities. My second quicker question is, you were talking about ROFRs and contractors, and you give them a ROFR and they're on standby. And I was wondering if you pay compensation to them for the right to have them on the ROFR, because it's kind of like an option. You can call them or not. And in the options market, of course, you pay for an option. And does that happen with a company? And also, I'd be curious how many times you put people on ROFRs and not call them. And if that happens a lot, does that sort of diminish their enthusiasm for working with you because they're not getting the work?
And I would just add, recognizing we have a different panel. Well, I see a witness approaching, so I'll let.
We're going to have Mr. Baldwin approach. He has been sworn and he's going to respond to the Commissioner's question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we will be able to provide that information to you first question, but in terms of the ROFR agreement, we don't incur any costs from keeping them on ROFR. We only have about 9 contractors that we keep on ROFR that we have this agreement with. So they like it because they know if we do invoke a ROFR that it carries with it 3 days of guaranteed work at 16 hours a day at the working rate. But we don't incur a cost just to have them as a choice to be on the ROFR. So they voluntarily elect to join.
Just to add to that, I think we have a question already that is asking us to go back to see how many times we've used it. So we're working on that.
All right, I think that's all the administrative matters from up here. So Attorney Pace, do you want to introduce this panel?
Yes, please. And good morning to the commissioners. Vincent Pace for the Connecticut Light and Power Company. And starting with Mr. O'Brien, just please identify your name and title for the record. Afterwards, the chair will administer the oath to the witness panel. Thank you.
Brendan O'Brien, Vice President of Rates and Revenue Requirements. Garrett Murray, Director of Revenue Requirements, Connecticut.
Doug Horton, I'm the Senior Vice President of Regulatory and Strategic Financial Planning for Eversource.
Jonathan Callan, Manager of Financial Forecasting.
Matthew Fallon, Assistant Treasurer, Corporate Finance and Cash Management.
All right, if the panel will raise your right hands, I'll administer the oath as set forth in General Statutes Section 125. Do you solemnly swear or solemnly and sincerely affirm, as the case may be, that the evidence you shall give concerning this case shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God, upon penalty of perjury?
I do.
Thank you. Does the panel have pre-filed material to adopt?
They do, Chairman. And so consistent with the approach I used on the first hearing day to be efficient, I'm going to ask them to respond in unison to avoid doing it 5 separate times. So when I ask you the questions, I'd like you to all respond as a panel. So for each of the witnesses, in connection with this proceeding, did you sponsor pre-filed testimony and/or interrogatories?
Yes.
Does any witness have any modifications or changes you want to identify at this time?
No.
And do you adopt those materials as your sworn testimony under oath?
Yes.
And we have no direct examination for the panel, Chairman, so they're free for cross-examination. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we will start with cross from authority staff.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, panel. Steve Capozzi, authority staff. Most, not all, but most of my questions today are about carrying charges. And I think I'm mostly going to refer to the February 13th testimony. But though I may refer back to the July 25th testimony as well. But we'll start with the February 13th testimony. And first are some technical questions. If you could open Exhibit ES-SFP 6, which is the calculation of the carrying costs.
Just give me one moment, please.
Sure.
Okay, I'm there.
Okay, thank you. So I just want to confirm first exactly how the company is calculating the carrying costs in column I. So if I look in the cell on line 6, which is the first row, I see a formula that has a hard-coded number of 9.1%. Can you just walk me through how that 9.1% is calculated?
Yes, and Mr. Murray can provide the details, but that is for each period. It's the authorized, it's our weighted average cost of capital for each of the periods. And you can see if you scroll through each of those cells, it will vary slightly over time. But Mr. Murray?
Nope, that's absolutely correct. So that's our weighted average cost of capital that's been grossed up for income taxes authorized in each of those prior rate case dockets. So either 140506 or 171046 are the 2 references.
Okay. And I think that's consistent with what I saw here, which is there are, I think, 4 separate numbers in this. 1 to reflect the pre-171046 rate case, and then 3 to reflect the 3 rate years of that rate case. Is that correct?
That's correct. And
Okay.
then post rate year 3, it remains in effect until the next rate case.
I think what I couldn't figure out was the exact number they were being grossed up by. Could you provide that does that differ for each each calculation for those 4 sets of calculations, would that gross up for taxes differ?
The calculation itself does not differ. What may differ, and I'd have to check when we can provide this,
Okay.
is whether or not the Connecticut tax rate differs, because there are surcharges on top of the baseline 7.5% that do differ from year to year. Just subject to check. It may have differed in this time period, but generally the calculation is the same. So we
Okay.
can provide that in the late file, the grossed up calculation of the authorized weighted average cost of capital.
Thank you. Yeah, Chairman, I would like to request that as a late file for each of the 4, unless there's more, for each of the 4 grossed up weighted average cost of capital figures.
Sure, that'll be late file 31. Oops. And it will be reference exhibit ESSFP6, column I. Please provide the, well, I guess I'll ask the panel for clarification. The WACC doesn't ever change after, except for a rate case. So the only, I am noticing like the percentage varies within the same rate period. So the only alternating input to the calculation would be the gross up, the tax changes. Is that correct?
Well, the weighted average cost of capital did change. So in 1405, docket number 140506, there was one authorized weighted average cost of capital, but in 171046, there were 3 separate weighted average cost of capital rates that were approved. The tax rates applied to each of those could change depending upon the surcharge that was in effect for the Connecticut state business tax at that point in time.
Okay. So maybe I'll just, I understand now, because I was looking at, I forgot about the 3-year rate plan in 171046. That's why.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Maybe can I just say, provide the inputs for the weighted average cost of capital, the gross weighted average cost of capital calculation for each of the varying numbers.
Absolutely. That's what I was going to say. We'll provide the authorized weighted average cost of capital, inclusive of the debt and equity portions, and then we'll provide the calculation of the gross up to those amounts. So it'll be all inclusive.
Okay. Thank you. That'll be late file 31.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to turn now to exhibit SFP-1, starting on page 17.
Just one moment. Excuse me, one moment, please. Yeah, the page starting with base rates at 3 million per year. Is it the page numbered 17?
Page 17 of 78 on SFP-1.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
And really, I want to start, so my questions are about the PURA's historical treatment of deferred storm costs. And so it's really starting on that subsection below that.
Got it.
So I just wanted to step through some of the testimony and make sure I understood the testimony and then ask some clarifying questions about that. So if I may, I'd like to sort of give my understanding of the company's position on the historical treatment of deferred expenses. And then just make any clarifications, tell me if I'm wrong or correct, if that's okay. So what I read here is that historically, carrying charges on deferred storm expenses were not applied until the regulatory asset was established, generally in a rate case. So at the start of the rate year, carrying charges would begin to accrue. But that the company believed, or the company states that it was still owed carrying costs from the time of the storm incurrence, or the storm cost incurrence. But that this difference was made up because the regulatory asset was in rate base with a return at the WACC, and that rate base was set in a rate case, which did not diminish. So it's because that regulatory asset was in rate base and approved as part of a rate case, that the value of that the balance of that regulatory asset didn't diminish. So the company was getting a larger return than strictly at the WACC because that regulatory asset balance didn't diminish over time or didn't reduce over time, only being adjusted in a subsequent rate case. And so the company at the time, these two factors roughly balanced each other to some degree. Is that a fair assessment of what happened or historically?
Generally, yes, and I'll let you continue with questions so I don't
do,
just start off on the
yeah.
wrong foot. But only one just, I do think important distinction, which is where you started, that there is a lot of, I think, dispute around carrying charges among the parties. We haven't seen any evidence or arguments yet, but I imagine there will be through the case. But there is, I think, broad alignment from what I understand among all parties, and PURA itself in its prior order has acknowledged that carrying charges shall accrue from the date of prudency. That's one detail that I think differed from what you said. So from the date of prudency, I think there is agreement amongst all parties that certainly carrying charges apply from that point and forward. Although in the past, the rate change has typically occurred with the first rate year in a rate case.
Okay.
May I ask how you define the date of prudency?
From the date that that PURA would issue its order, determining that the storm costs are allowed to be recovered are prudent and therefore allowed to be recovered.
Thank you.
So, yeah, okay, so the prudent storm costs may have been reviewed for prudency in a separate proceeding, and at the time of that decision, carrying costs would accrue. Is that not necessarily at the start of the rate year? Is that?
That's correct.
clarification? Okay.
And I'm sure we'll get there with your questions, but the timing, the frequency, the cadence, the magnitude of storm costs, all very different. And so generally, those things happened close in time to one another.
Yeah, and so that was actually my next question. So I also understood it that the company, that practice was acceptable to the company at that time because there was a relatively low balance on the deferred storm costs and there was a short distance between rate cases.
That's right.
Okay. Okay, and there are potential, for the storm costs here, the company wouldn't be supportive of that kind of framework being applied to the storm costs under review here.
Well, that jumped a little bit. I think that PURA has altered its framework in the UI decision that was issued in August of 2023, which had a fundamental change in terms of how PURA had treated it prior to that point, which is important.
So can I interrupt?
Absolutely.
I was sort of gonna just ask you with that question, then what other factors would affect the company's, so I was gonna get to that decision. 'Cause I
Okay,
think
so then
that's
I'm
in
sorry.
here.
So take me back
Yeah,
to your question.
Yeah, so my question just is, for those two factors alone, would the company, if just those two factors alone were under consideration, would the company sort of accept that kind of framework for this? Or are those two factors, meaning level of the storm balance, deferred storm costs, and the distance between rate cases, would those factors alone, would the company support that kind of treatment for these costs under consideration here? Are those two factors alone enough to say, you know what, we need a different framework?
Okay, so I think you're saying if the reality sitting here now was such that I guess the storm balance was not so significant and rate cases were anticipated to be closer in time, would we be advocating for recovery of carrying charges that have occurred in the past?
Yeah,
If we had an expectation of rate-based treatment going forward in the way it was done prior to the UI decision?
Yeah, it's a weird question. That's not quite what I was asking. What I was asking was, based on what we have on the storm balance under review now, do you think that framework would work, absent the 220808 decision?
Okay, so you're saying if the storm balance that are deemed in this proceeding to be prudent were to be placed into rate base in the next rate case, would that work? I mean, I would say that's not the case, and that's why we had to make the filing in July of 2025 that we did, because there were three things that changed the circumstances, that changed our expectation of how carrying charges would be treated versus PURA's historical practice. I am sitting here fully expecting and frankly hoping that PURA will authorize an amount to be securitized. That will be the best thing for our customers. Securitization is a game changer for our customers. Securitization will allow us to recover these prudently incurred costs over time at the lowest possible rate, but that will fundamentally change that rate-based treatment. That compensatory nature that we talk about is now, it's evaporated. And that's a good thing overall, meaning that once it's securitized, then we will not have Eversource as an entity any recognition or recovery of carrying charges at all. The cost of debt becomes a pure pass-through to the special purpose entity. And so it's not going into rate base as I'm sitting here now. I don't think that's possible. So the three things that we talked about, the cause of us changing our approach in requiring us to make carrying charges an issue in this proceeding as opposed to in a future rate case where Pura's change in its practice in the 2023 UI decision, the legislature's passage of Senate Bill 4, which authorized us to securitize, which then would take away either under that UI framework or under the prior framework, it would take away carrying charges at all. There would be nothing for carrying charges from 2018 to the point of security. Nothing would be recognized under either framework. And then it also was the fact that we had the Supreme Court ruling in the Aquarion case that discussed deferred expenses being a customer debt that are to be paid by customers over time, including with interest.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and setting aside the large storm balance to be securitized, what about on a going forward basis? Would the sort of historical treatment, and I think I want to get to this later because I think the company talks about how to, in the testimony, they offer suggestions for how to address, storm cost deferrals in the future. So I do want to touch on that a little more later, but is that like the historical approach acceptable to the company on a going forward basis?
I mean, I would say it would be, but I'll tell you, I expect to make a proposal in the rate case, that we will make a proposal in the rate case that will be better for all parties and will, frankly, in my opinion, be better than that treatment. I think that
Okay.
the nature of storms, the magnitude, the frequency, the variability in the costs all lend themselves to a different approach. Because one thing I think we all feel is we don't want to ever find ourselves in this position again. And if we were to go revert to the prior framework, I think we would be setting ourselves up to potentially be in that situation again, meaning if we're in a 4-year period between rate cases and the magnitude of storms is so significant and we're building it up and waiting till that next rate case, I think we'll be doing customers a disservice. So I think I expect to talk quite a lot about that in our upcoming rate case filing for how to treat going forward.
And that was going to be one of my questions. Would the rate case, would the company, for the company, is the rate case the right place to make that kind of change to establish that kind of framework?
For prospective storms, it has to be done in a rate case.
Okay. But do you mind if we talk about it here?
Not at all, no.
We're all here, okay.
I'd love to.
Because I think I do have some more questions on that, and I do want to return to that. But I'm kind of trying to step through your testimony sequentially a little bit, though I will bounce around. Okay, so that's, okay.
Can I just ask a clarifying
Yeah,
question
go ahead.
before I forget it, Mr. Horton? I was just trying to follow I was totally on board, agreed completely with the securitization difference, but that difference is only with respect to the carrying cost that otherwise, Model A being rate-based treatment, Model B being securitization. Securitization is a game changer with respect to the rate, you no longer have an amortizing regulatory asset and rate base and we're not paying carrying charges on that asset over time. But it makes no difference with respect to the carrying charges between incurrence and the determination of prudence, right? Like that's.
Absolutely. But I think the important thing is, and I don't want to be too long-winded at the outset, I would love to let Mr. Capozzi get through, but I think that it is important to understand that under the prior framework, meaning prior to that UI decision, there was just inherent in that framework, there was a compensatory nature of the carrying charges that were incurred from the date it was placed into rate base and prospectively and prior to that. So the UI decision made that go away, where at that point in time, the UI decision said, no, only carrying charges from the date it goes into rates and forward prospectively shall be recognized. We put on evidence to show how substantial and significant that was. So from our perspective, that was inappropriate. We expected to make a proposal in our rate case to address that. But when securitization comes along, in either case, in either the prior to the UI decision or the UI decision application, then carrying charges that would go to Eversource are gone. It would only be from the state. If you're securitizing a balance and that balance does not include carrying charges, then we're not getting carrying charges up to the point of recovery of that securitized amount. The only thing securitization would recover would be the securitized cost of debt.
Right.
And so that's what caused us to insert into this discussion the carrying charges that we've incurred from 2018 to today. Does that help?
Yes. So absent the UI, the 220808 decision, one may expect, like absent that standard, one might expect, for instance, in this case, that upon the issuance of the final decision in this case, that the company would have recognized carrying charges between the date of the issuance of this decision and when it ultimately is able to recover the securitization. At some point, at the risk of being blunt, I don't know if this is a rude way to put it at all, but the company gets handed a check under securitization, right? And then it's essentially the bill servicer of the revenue to pay the ultimate debt holder moving forward. But I guess what I'm asking is, what's the company's position on carrying costs, getting back to what we were talking about before, between the dates in this case where there'd be a finding of prudence and the date at which the company ultimately recovers the actual costs that are determined to be prudent?
Right. So my belief and understanding sitting here now is, there is, the way that I see it, no disputing that Pura's practice and precedent under, frankly, either prior process, meaning prior to the UI decision or in the UI decision, that the carrying charges would accrue from the date of prudence and forward. That I don't believe was changed in the UI decision. The practice and standard was still that Pura would allow for carrying charges from the date of prudence and forward. Again, it just so happened to be that oftentimes storm costs were also set into rates in the time of a rate case, so those things happened at the same point in time, but it would be, so what the UI decision changed was when you begin to recover that, no longer would we get that compensatory nature by having a fixed amount in rate base that doesn't reduce over a rate period, which was prior to the UI decision. That was gone. Instead, you'd get just the recovery of the carrying charges over the period of amortization of the storm. So it changed that dynamic, but I would still submit that the precedent still held that from the date of prudence and forward, carrying charges would accrue. So I think it's really just a question of, so now that all these things have happened, what is due to the company for carrying charges that have been incurred by the company up to that point? And we've put in a proposal, we've had to, because of all the circumstances that changed, and we're changing, under our feet over time.
Got it.
Hope that helps.
Sorry, Mr. Cohesi, I'm sure I just stepped all over your
Uh,
questions.
No, no, and I hope the commissioners jump in because I'm a little out of my element here. So as I go through, I'd appreciate any assistance. But I do want to, I want to continue back because I want to work the way up. I want to work our way up to the UI rate case. So I still want to go back to sort of the historical treatment. I think starting on page 18, so moving up a page, the company parallels. I read this as company sort of paralleling the historical treatment of deferred storm costs with capital spending in a multi-year rate plan. I'll let you get there and let me know when you're had a chance to review it.
And I'm sorry, so you're on,
I think it's on page 18, starting on page 18.
and just like approximately which line?
Yeah, hold on. Maybe it's page, yeah, okay, it's at the very bottom, I think.
Oh, sure, yeah. So that return is not reduced alongside the,
Yeah.
yep.
That's right. So here, I think the company was, the way I read it, the company was paralleling sort of the treatment of deferred storm costs with the way capital spending was dealt with in multi-year plan rate cases, or in rate cases where the company has a fixed rate base set, at the end of a rate case with a decision. So the return on that rate base is based on a rate base balance that's not decreasing as that plant depreciates. But on the other hand, that's counterbalanced by new additions going in this parallel. We're talking about capital spending. So on the other hand, that is counterbalanced by new investments going into service that are not reflected in rate base. Is that
That's right.
companies making that parallel?
To some extent, and there are though critical differences and distinctions as to why storm costs aren't akin to capital that we spend on a day-to-day for our core business. In fact, capital that we spend on a day-to-day for our core business is recovered in base rates. So we talked about in the testimony, we were trying to explain effectively, while it is similar, there are differences. So capital that we spend for our core business, to the extent that approximates the level of depreciation that we have in our base rates, then base rates would be designed inherently to recover the ongoing carrying charges, even on newly incurred capital that's not explicitly in rates, whereas storm costs, just by their nature, are not captured in base rates, even that, in that way. Even under the rate-based treatment, it was a different paradigm because it was a deferred expense. It was explicitly not intended to be recovered by base rates and, subject to ebb and flow for normal course of business, things like core expenditures and O&M, et cetera.
Okay, understood. But once a regulatory asset for deferred storm costs is created, that is now in rate base.
Well, we create the deferred asset for a storm cost when we incur that storm cost, and it's included in rate base under PURA's practice prior to the UI decision in a rate case.
Okay. Okay.
But the deferred asset, the deferred asset is created at the point when the cost is incurred.
And my questions are really getting at this counterbalance between in the historical treatment of this, the counterbalance between, a regulatory asset and rate base that's fixed and the balance is not decreasing going forward. So there's a bit of an over recovery, but that's counterbalanced from the company's perspective by the company not earning carrying costs on that prior to that being in rates. So those are my questions are trying to get around that. Because historically, if we're talking historically, rate cases were traditionally multi-year rate plans, generally 3 years, maybe not always, but usually 3 years. Is that right?
I don't know if it's, I know that the 2018 rate case was 3 years, but Mr. Murray can elaborate.
Yeah, so in the 2018 rate case, that was the case. It was a 3-year rate plan, but in the 2014 rate case, it was really a 1-year rate plan. They did have a second rate year, but that was only to reflect an adjustment to the ROE because there was a penalty imposed at the time. And prior to that, I don't believe they were 3 years. They were either 1 or 2 years, generally speaking.
Okay, all right. Okay, thank you for that clarification. So in the 14 rate case, if the only thing that was changed was the ROE, rate base was not reflected for that, or changed for that second rate year.
No.
Okay, in the 17-1046, the last rate case, did we have 3 different, for each rate year, did we have rate base reflecting changes for those 3 years?
There were subsequent rate changes, so there was 2. So rate year 1 was set in rates, rate year 2 and 3 were then subsequently changed.
Okay.
From there, something that did happen, we added a subsequent docket, 18-11-12 for storm reviews, in which we did add additional storms to rate base, which were then changed in rate year 3 and frozen from that point in time. So the concept is still the same and it remains the same from rate year 3 forward. And just for the record, rate year 3 was calendar year 2020. So from that point forward, rates had been frozen, rate base had been frozen in base distribution rates.
Okay. 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 I think on page, jumping to page 24, I believe. I hope.
Okay, I'm there.
Okay. I think this might, I have page 24 on my notes and I see there's some information in here that's related. I think it was discussed in a little more detail in prior pages, but the company provided an example in their testimony about this historical treatment and how this counterbalancing of rate base being at a fixed value, not diminishing. So for example, deferred storm costs that are in rate base are sort of staying at that value. The company's earning carrying charges at the weighted average cost of capital on that. They're earning slightly more because that rate base isn't, that regulatory asset balance isn't decreasing. And they provide an example from the 140506 rate case here. Do you see where the company calculated that there was about $10 million of sort of additional costs incurred by that, recovered by the company for that? Does that ring a bell?
Yes.
Okay. So, did the company do an analysis to see if you had tracked carrying costs back to the time of cost incurrence, what that was? So I just want to see what the other end of that balancing scale is, you know?
Yeah, the company did not do that
Okay.
analysis.
Is that possible, or is or is that ship sailed?
We could try to take a look at that. I don't know what data is available, 10 plus years ago for those storms, but we can certainly take a look at that and provide that as a late file if we can get that information.
Okay, I mean, do you have an estimate on?
I really don't.
Okay. All right.
Would you like a late file though?
Yeah, I think I think we can request a late file.
Okay, that'll be late file 32. Mr. Capozzi, do you want to suggest a prompt?
Yeah, so, I'm looking for how the company put it in their testimony because it's going to come out jumbled. So, I'm looking for, calculated carrying costs. Starting from the time of cost incurrence for I guess the docket 140506 storm deferred costs.
Understood. I
Yeah.
know exactly what you're looking
Okay.
for, yep. To try to produce what were the actual carrying charges where we provide
Yeah,
that
right.
example for 10 million, the compensatory nature.
Got it. So I have, please provide calculated carrying costs starting from the time of incurrence for the deferred costs authorized in docket 140506.
Yeah.
Is that-
And that'll be helpful. I mean, looking at that 10 million, my guess, I'll ask the company, would an educated guess be that the 10 million is probably less than the calculated carrying charges from the time of cost incurrence, most likely?
I don't know that I would
Okay.
guess at this point because
Okay.
there was less time in between rate cases. I believe the storms that were reviewed prior to that 140506 docket were from 2011, 2012. So those storms were much more recent as compared to the storms we're discussing today in a future rate case. So I couldn't issue a guess here today.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I think, well, how does the company define time of cost incurrence? I saw that phrase a lot in the testimony when speaking about carrying charges. So what specifically does it mean by time of cost incurrence?
Sure. I mean, we're really talking about from the date that that regulatory asset was created. So we're trying to get to the point of we've had to finance those expenses contemporaneously. And to do so requires the capital cost just in the same as the underlying costs that we've had to finance. They're two sides of the same coin from our perspective. So in that regard, that's really what we mean. When we originally incurred the incremental capital to finance that incremental cost in the deferred asset.
The other day I was discussing with the first panel about accrual accounting. So how does is the time of cost incurrence at least? So for example, if we look at the calculation of carrying charges in SFP-6 that we were talking about earlier, is that time of cost incurrence the time the costs were accrued via accrual accounting?
It is, and I think Mr. Capozzi, we heard that. I mean, again, I always do this, not that we can suggest a late file, but we could produce a late file. So your point was, so accrual accounting could be, in which it is, we set up we recognize that regulatory asset once we have the expectation of the cost. I know it's more than that, Mr. O'Brien can elaborate, but so it's not necessarily from the date that we pay it. The date that we pay it would really be a more precise calculation. So we looked at that. It immaterially moves the needle in the end, but we absolutely can produce a calculation if we wanted to tether it closer to when the dollars are actually spent. And in fact, that's similar to what Massachusetts does in its storm cost recovery mechanism that we have in place there. Rather than the date that the asset was established, tether it to the date that the cost was incurred. Very reasonable request. So it would lower the overall balance that we've calculated here slightly.
When you say the date the cost was incurred, do you mean the date like cash was paid to the?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. I think it's more of an approximation. I think we talked about this. I think we have a late file. It's a little difficult because we have accrual accounting to trace everything back right to when the dollar was spent. But like you had asked in that late filed, we can get it close based on a review of when the invoices are received and paid, which is 90% of the costs or
Okay.
80% of the costs.
And that was where I was going. And I do want to request that late file, but before we do that, can I just look? Let me tell you what page. I want to refer you to page 40 of SFP1. And let me know when you're there.
I'm there, yep.
Okay, and I'm looking at figure 2, which I think the company had produced this. Well, just setting that aside, when I was looking at this, I was thinking about, the date, accrual accounting versus the time cash was paid. And for example, I'm looking at, if I look at years, so what we see in the gray bars are the deferred storm costs, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And so when I'm looking at, for example, year 2020 and 2021, I jumped to there because of Storm Isaias, and I thought, okay, this should be an obvious thing. And what I'm seeing, is we're probably not seeing all or most of Storm Isaias costs in 2020 because of the number, which is 197 million. What I'm probably seeing, and I'm sure maybe we're seeing some, but what I'm probably seeing is a bulk of those costs in 2021. And that to me looks like, up to a year difference. And I believe this is, well, I should have started with this first question. I think if I'm looking at the gray bar, so the unsupported or unapproved deferred storm costs, is that reflective of it must be reflective of costs being paid because of that? Is that reasonable or no?
It would absolutely be reflective of costs that are paid, or more accurately, reflective of invoices received. Can I just have one moment to confer? So there's, I think, a couple of factors, but the main factor is going to be, and we can put this in that late filed if you want to get there, but the main reason is going to be that this is reflecting an average balance. So ECS occurred in August, and so it's really reflecting 4 months of that when you look at an average monthly balance. It's not the end of period balance, which would be fully reflective of the accrued ECS costs.
Okay. Okay, and I imagine, I'm trying to make a distinction between cost accrual accounting versus when cash is paid, but I imagine there's a number of steps that the company has to take from when they know they incurred a certain cost, and you have to have the cash available. So is it even fair to say, meaning, well, I guess my question is, should carrying charges apply from the time cash is paid? Is that even fair, or is it the company just can't magically produce cash? So I assume there's steps you have to take to acquire that cash. So there's some time in between when the costs are first and the work is first done, and the company knows they're gonna have to pay costs for that, to some time later when you're expecting an invoice. We don't know exactly maybe when that'll come in, but once that comes in, now you have to be ready to make payment on that. So what are the steps in that period that the company has to take to make sure, they have the cash for that work?
And Mr. Fallon can talk about that as our assistant treasurer. He can go into great detail. We, on a daily basis, monitor our cash needs and expectations. And so Mr. Fallon can talk about all that goes into ensuring that we stay liquid and can pay our bills timely.
Yeah, so what you're suggesting is that, we see an anticipated cash need. We need to prepare for that ahead of when we actually pay out the cash, and that is certainly the case. And what I would say is we anticipate storm costs, right? sort of normal course storm costs as part of our budgeting, right? So we're thinking about how do the financings play out over the year? But when we have an extraordinary storm cost, that creates an unanticipated cash need. So we do, yes, have to plan ahead to, the period when we actually see the storm costs to make sure that we have the financing in place.
And I'm sorry, Mr., if I could just build on that. So we put this in the testimony, you may get there, but so on a daily basis, we're funding all of our capital needs through a combination of funds from operations, so what's cash that's coming in the door, and existing and available capital resources, namely and first, our short-term debt. But short-term debt is limited to $600 million for CL&P. So as a bill is coming in, if we need to access capital initially that's not paid for through, customer receipts, we're accessing short-term debt, which has a natural limit, and also just by its nature and name is short-term. And so as the short-term debt balances grow through a combination of all of our capital requirements, but storms being a major component, we're exhausting our short-term debt capacity. Matt and his team then take steps and needs to take steps to ensure that we have enough capacity to respond to emergent events, et cetera. So we'll have to then perm that out with long-term debt or equity in order to be able to maintain adequate liquidity in our short-term debt capacity.
If I may jump in, can you tell us a little bit about how the storm costs affect your working capital and how you manage your working capital, or do you think of it separately, or do you think of it as impacting that?
Well, I think if I understand it, and again, Mr. Fallon will please chime in and give everyone a break from me, but I think that's what I'm saying. We have working capital requirements for run-of-the-mill day-to-day businesses, also for all of the reconciling mechanisms. But then as a storm happens, just like any other bill that comes due, we'll need to pay that bill, 45 days from the date of receipt of that invoice. And so we're doing that with a combination of our funds that are coming in the door on a daily basis from our customers and from our short-term debt balances or short-term debt capacity. But as we approach our limits for short-term debt, then we'll need to be able to replace that short-term debt with long-term debt. And as we balance our capital structure, we're not only able to issue debt, we can't just issue debt to finance and to replace that. We also need to balance that with equity as well. And so working capital, and we talked about this in the rate case, and I'll stop to make sure that I'm hitting your point, but we do have in base rates through a lead lag study recognition of working capital. Catastrophic storms are explicitly, specifically not included in that calculus.
Okay.
But really that just sets, that just sets the level of, the cost of that working capital associated with base rate items in base rates. On a day-to-day basis, we need to fund whatever bills come in, or we go, I won't say that word. We go B word, right? We're gonna pay the bills as they come in with whatever available resources that we have. The working capital allowance and base rates doesn't cover the catastrophic storms.
That's what I was looking for. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Sorry, just to be clear, I mean, it's all fungible, right? You're looking for.
That's exactly right.
You have a expected requirement for all sorts of things, including storm costs, and you referred to 600 million, that's probably a corporate revolver or something. But you pull the revolver, or do you issue commercial paper? You're just in and out of the market, I would think.
Yes, so what we do is the 600 million that we're referring to is financed at CL&P through the parent. The parent finances initially, as Mr. Horton said, through short-term debt commercial paper. As that commercial paper reaches its limit, then we need to go out and finance longer term in the capital markets.
Okay, so all that financing is done up at the parent at Eversource. So CL&P doesn't issue its own paper?
CL&P does not issue its own commercial paper. It does issue its own long-term debt.
Yep. Okay, thanks.
And I'll follow up on that. So, but you are talking about, when you say going to capital markets, you're talking about debt.
Well, I would say it's both. I mean,
Because it's the parent level, but.
well,
Sorry, I was referring to both debt and equity markets at the parent.
Okay, thanks.
Very good. All right, so I want to go back now and just discuss a little bit my understanding of what happened with, from the company's point of view with the decision in docket 220808. So my understanding, and I really just want to confirm my understanding, but from what I read of the testimony that according to the company, the framework we had discussed, the historical treatment of deferred storm costs changed in that decision when the authority moved the deferred storm costs, the regulatory asset for the deferred storm costs out of rate base and is treated as a deferred expense. And that, doing that solved the problem of earning the weighted average cost of capital on an asset without a declining balance. But according to the company, that changed then, what did that change do? I didn't give you a page number.
No, that's totally fine. So what that did was that then removed the compensatory nature of the prior rate-based treatment that I was describing to Chairman Wheel, meaning it no longer provided any recognition at all of carrying charges incurred prior to the rate effective date, only prospectively from there.
Okay. Do you know if any authority decision on the historical prior practice ever articulated that balance being a reason for how that framework was, for why that framework was established?
Mr. Capozzi, I read your mind, but I can't get there. There was actually in that order, and I was trying to find the reference. I know we put it in multiple places here, but in 2208, it actually articulates exactly that. It says that the rate-based treatment let me just read it. Right, so this is in that order, 220808. It's on page 29. In there it says, the inclusion of a regulatory asset in rate base would overstate the regulatory asset return or carrying charges beyond the rate year because the reduction in the regulatory asset due to amortization expense would not be accounted for. That was actually the rationale PURA used in changing its methodology in that proceeding.
Prior to that decision, did the authority ever articulate in a decision, though, that the reason carrying charges were allowed at the and not permitted prior to a prudency review was to balance the rate base issue, or whatever you call it?
Just one moment, please.
Sure.
I think I could take a late file on that and we could elaborate. I don't know that I'll find a specific bullseye example where PURA goes into great lengths to talk about the compensatory nature of its prior treatment. But again, the prior treatment was accepted and made sense because the circumstances were that the storm costs were less significant, rate cases were closer in time, so the balances didn't accrue to the extent that they did now. And so that compensatory nature, we took a late file to, talk about the $10 million and try to calculate exactly what that cost was. The fact is that it was a relatively smaller component, so I don't think there was as much concern by either the company or by other parties that it was going to be overly or underly compensated. It's probably not a word.
Okay, and you know what? I forgot to get that late file. that we were talking about earlier about
Right.
the thing, Chairman, I would.
I
to
took the
request
liberty
that.
of typing it out
Okay.
in anticipation that you would ask for it. So that'd be late file 33. And what I have is please provide a recalculation of carrying costs requested in this case based upon the issuance of payment rather than based upon the creation of the accrual account. Does that capture where you're?
That's right. But I think you also wanted to add to that the figure 2 sort of reconciliation of the storm balances.
We can add that to that.
Okay.
Thank you.
I get to just say that because I just review these things that everybody else does the real work.
I know it's fun, right?
Take whatever you want. This is
Okay. That'll be late file 33. Mr. Capozzi, while you're pausing, I actually had a clarification question, I think, for Mr. Horton. It's again about 220808. And this actually is something that I was confused about in that decision myself. And I'm trying to, I was excited to kind of read about this in your testimony, and I still wasn't really clear on the difference, at least from like the revenue side, like from the, so if you take a regulatory asset, you put it in rate base, that's the value, it's X dollars time treated with the WACC, just like any rate base item. But what that does from a rate making perspective, that ultimately just ends up in a revenue number for presumably in a single rate year, like for 220808. That's just in there and it's locked in there until rates are changed. And I understand that that's sort of the recognition element that your testimony discusses. I'm confused, and I think I might just be missing something in the decision itself. I'm confused about how it's any different, and I'm really not trying to combat your perspective, because frankly, like when I saw this in that decision, I didn't understand what Pura was trying to accomplish, because I don't see the difference of removing something from rate base, but just allowing it to amortize at the WACC over however many years you want to say, 2 years. You're still just locking a single year of that revenue stream into the revenue requirement, from my perspective, in the same way that you would be if it were in rate base. So I don't understand, again, from the perspective of the effect on the revenue requirement, what's the difference?
So, Mr. Murray, we answered data requests on this and that you will also be excited to read, which is great. But so Mr. Murray can dig that up and point you to it. I would describe the difference as this. The practice prior to the UI rate case was that, let's just assume, let's say you have a storm balance of $100 million. That's going to be recovered, I'm going to say, over 5 years for simple math. You'd put that $100 million into rate base, you'd recover it over 5 years, so that balance would be fixed in rates at $100 million, but then it would be amortized over time. So what would actually be reflected in rates would be the return on and of that $100 million. So you'd get $20 million for the amortization as being 100 divided by 5 years, plus you'd get the return on that balance. But in the prior treatment, that return would be calculated on a $100 million balance. Maybe it would be an average, whatever, still effectively $100 million. So you're getting that set return, the $20 million plus the return of $10 million each of those rate years. What Pura did in the 220808 order is it calculated the total revenue requirement over the 5 years. And it said, let's just imagine that it's going to be just like that chart, figure 1 in the testimony. The balance will come down. The annual revenue requirement will come down. Pura took the annual revenue requirement over each of the 5 years, added it together, and divided that number by 5, which gives you a much lower recovery over the period. So 2 things there. One is the big picture here takes away any recognition of prior carrying charges at all. It's gone. Now you're just recovering the carrying charges from the point it goes into rates and forward. You're recovering those carrying charges over 5 years. So Pura put that lower balance into base rates, into rate base and base rates. So and then didn't explicitly calculate a return on that, if you will. It just said, okay, your recovery return on and of over 5 years is going to be the $100 million, let's say, plus another $40 million of carrying charges. So it'd be 140 divided by 5. You'd get whatever that math is equally each year. Bigger issue, no compensatory nature. Financial rate wonk issue does not reflect accurately the time value of money for the company because it actually undercuts that too, but that's a smaller detail. We will then get less carrying charges than we've actually incurred even over that period because we will have $100 million outstanding that we're not getting until the end of year 5. That math doesn't accommodate us for that or compensate us for that. So but that's a smaller point.
Thanks. I did understand that point, and I think I understand that the company's historic position prior to all that was recognizing that was sort of an acceptance of, well, at least, like, it's not actually recognizing the true time value of money that we're actually incurring, but to some extent, that's okay because there's this offsetting nature of this stuff is sort of stuck in rate base potentially for longer than our actual incurrence of the amortization, right? Like that's the same way as any other rate base
That's right.
element, right? That as stuff depreciates, new stuff comes on, so the depreciation expense assigned to the old stuff is now covering new stuff. Same kind of principle, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I think my confusion then was it doesn't make a difference. The 220808 treatment wouldn't make a difference in a hypothetical reality where the single rate year was really the only, like if you again changed rates exactly a year later, which you could somehow do a 350-day rate case, like in some reality where you could do that, there would be no difference. But because the 220808 treatment, the company would still recover the actual cost of the year 1 amortization of that expense, right? But then moving into the second year, that's where the two kind of models, the rate-based model versus the 2208 model, start to diverge. Is that accurate?
A little. I mean, I think so what you're saying is that under the 2208 example, if the expectation was that it was a 1-year rate year, one-year rate plan, you'd put $100 million into rate base. So yes, agreed with that. The issue though is if it were a multi-year rate plan and then you changed rates every single year to reflect the decreasing balance, that would actually be a more accurate way to do what PURA did in 220808. That would take care of my second, like financial nerd concern, but that would be a more accurate way to do it, but it still would not provide any recognition of carrying charges prior to that point. So you'd have to listen to me drone on for hours about why we need to change the mechanism if that's what PURA were to do. But conceptually, yes, you'd put $100 million in until the next time it's set. If it's set the next year, it would come down to 80.
Yep. Okay, understood.
Or no. I guess what would happen in that case, if it's a 1-year rate year, theoretically, PURA would give us $100 million over that rate year. So anyways, I took us down a path. I shouldn't even have said that.
No, this is important because wouldn't PURA what PURA would be giving you is the revenue necessary for they'd be giving you essentially the amortization expense plus the return on the remaining value. They give you the revenue necessary to support the $100 million asset over a single year. And that's sort of what I'm getting at is that's kind of what PURA did in 2208 also. So that's what I mean that like if you were comparing those two models, the traditional model versus the 220808 model, there wouldn't actually be a difference if there was another rate change a year later because it would the revenue necessary to support the supporting revenue would be the same in real life for the first year. But then after the first year, there'd be a difference, right? Like because
I think the thing is that if scenario A is an assumption of storm cost recovery over 5 years, but we're going to put $100 million into rate base and fix it. That's what used to be done. And then you're saying scenario B is the same thing. Recovery over 5 years, we're going to put $100 million into rate base and fix it with an expectation that that's going to be fixed for 1 year. Yeah, it's the same thing in the first year.
Yeah.
That's
and
right.
It's like because in the traditional rate base model, I'm not criticizing, I'm just saying in real life in the second year, now you've got more revenue than is necessary to actually support that asset in real life in rate base because you're not recognizing the amortization. You're not recognizing that the value of the asset has decreased and so is the return because you're still using the 1-year model. But it's that benefit to the company that, as I understand it, made it acceptable to use that to sort of smooshily recognize the cost of capital that wasn't reflected in that model to begin with.
Nailed it. Yes.
Okay.
Exactly.
Got it.
And I'll be brief, but just to honor the commitment made by Mr. Horton, the response we go over this in his OCC 576. So in there, they asked for a hypothetical of $1 billion amortized under 3 scenarios. So we provided a table there, and I think that walks through pretty well this entire discussion you guys just had.
Thank you. I, of course, reviewed that with every other interrogatory response in this case, but thanks for reminding me.
Me too.
I'm hearing that now I'm the only one up here who understands, maybe. Just kidding. Don't have a say. I mean, do you want me to keep going up?
Slow down the pace of my speaking. Okay.
I am totally on board with you. I get it. All right, Mr. Capozzi, you can continue.
Okay. I think I have just a couple more sets of, or like one more group of questions about, well, I think I'm done with the carrying charge. My questions regarding carrying charges. I have
Mr. Capozzi, then,
Yes.
is this a good time for me to jump in for a question then? Okay, so, all right, so, going back to your table, that showed the carrying costs, exhibit ESSFP-6, I believe. So, column I that Mr. Capozzi brought up at the beginning. You're showing carrying costs at the weighted average cost of capital. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So, we're talking about securitization here, right? Securitization is a debt instrument. And as you said that, obviously when you have to support these costs, you first issue debt, right? You issue short term and then you kick it up to get additional support. But my understanding from GAAP and just other resources, and I'm certainly no expert, but there could be a rationale to use the weighted average cost of debt instead of the weighted average cost of capital for carrying costs. And given a whole bunch of factors, including your expectation of both cost recovery and securitization here of your prudently incurred costs, would you be willing to show column I carrying costs based on the weighted average cost of debt in late file 31?
We absolutely could break that out. And I think, you mentioned GAAP. I'll kick it to Mr. O'Brien to speak slower than I will, but I do get excited. But so yes, we could absolutely break out the carrying costs between its components. So for the cost of debt and the cost of equity, you did mention though that there's a rationale under GAAP to only recognize for regulatory the cost of debt. And that for Mr.
For certain regulatory assets that are it's a question. Obviously, it's a regulatory policy question. What is the appropriate benchmark for carrying costs? And so I guess I'm asking, what's your rationale to use weighted average cost of capital as compared to weighted average cost of debt?
If I could I'm going to let Mr. O'Brien speak, but just to get one thing on the table. So our rationale is to use the weighted average cost of capital because that has been our cost. We could not, without securitization, we are not able to finance individual capital needs with just debt. We have to balance all of our capital requirements with a combination of debt and equity. We're issuing debt as Commissioner Smith pointed out, we're issuing, money is fungible, and we're paying for all of our cash needs, paying our employees, paying our invoices with cash available to us. And that's not just debt. We have debt that supplements funds that are coming in from our other, so we utilize all of our capital to do that, meaning that is why, from our perspective, the appropriate application of a carrying cost is a weighted cost of capital. I will just mention, though, that Massachusetts, to your point about, well, is there a sort of a policy decision that's made? The mechanism that exists in Massachusetts, in my view, recognizes that balancing that you're describing. It's an entirely different framework, one that I think we'll talk about in the rate case, but there, the department acknowledges and has a mechanism in place to provide more timely recovery. We have rates that reflect the costs on a much more frequent basis. We go in essentially annually to review, and the department approves our storm costs on a essentially contemporaneous basis for recovery over 5 years. And in there, Massachusetts allows us to accrue carrying charges not at our weighted cost of capital, but at the prime rate from the date of cost incurrence, from the date that we pay the invoice effectively. In there, I think the department's rationale for doing that is really, to your point, to balance that we need to have some recognition that we're not, yes, there is a cost of the capital that's supporting that deferred asset, but there needs to be a balancing between the company and its customers. So rather than authorizing the full weighted cost of capital, there the department authorizes the use of the prime rate, which isn't tied to our costs. It's not tied to, it's a rate that's publicly available, whatever it's used for, but it's not our cost of debt. It's not our full weighted cost of capital. That's, I think, a way for, generally it's between the cost of debt and the full weighted average cost of capital.
Well, that might be another column, another that you could model for us. But we're all here because this is an atypical regulatory asset, and it has a planned mechanism for financing. And so, to me, I think we need to step back and think about why it differs from what would come up in a rate case in terms of treatment of regulatory assets and liabilities, right? That there's something obviously very unique about this, and that's why we're here. But Mr. O'Brien.
And just to cover the topic of GAAP that Mr. Horton mentioned, I think the reason that is outlined in our testimony gets back to the 2208 decision in the UI case. And in there, one of PURA's conclusions that was made to adjust and take regulatory assets out of rate base and allow for the recovery moving forward was a reference to GAAP and the difference between an incurred cost and an allowable cost under ASC 980. And I think the important distinguishment there was in the decision, I think, PURA was using GAAP to reach that conclusion. And I think there are a few important points. I think number one, really, GAAP doesn't define or dictate rate making. It's really the opposite, where rate making really defines and leads to the GAAP accounting from an accounting perspective as decisions are made. And the other thing to point out is that, when talking about an incurred cost, the difference there in ASC 980 is really specific to a particular component of carrying charges. In a debt-based carrying cost, whether that's in a weighted average cost of capital, or as you referenced, just an average cost of debt or the prime rate, that does represent an incurred cost under the generally accepted accounting principles. It really represents an interest cost that a company would pay when we go out and issue debt. And the distinguishment from an allowable cost really references the equity portion of a weighted average cost of capital. And really there, under the GAAP rules, the distinguishment is not to indicate that a weighted average cost of capital isn't allowed or shouldn't be recognized from a rate-making standpoint. As Mr. Horton referenced, I think from our perspective, it's really, how have these costs been financed historically? GAAP really there is just outlining that from a recognition perspective, the equity portion of the return in a weighted average cost of capital is generally recognized at the point of realization rather than being deferred on the balance sheet as a regulatory asset, unless there's a very particular set of circumstances under the revenue recognition guidance of ASC 980 are met to be eligible to defer that cost. But just to your point, I think the reason GAP's kind of entered this equation is the 2208 decision certainly references that and really outlines that distinction, but doesn't really capture the fact that a debt-based carrying cost is actually an incurred cost and is very commonly deferred as a regulatory asset.
Appreciate that. And I am very familiar with the principle that regulatory accounting supersedes GAAP. It's a well-recognized principle. But in this case, I actually think GAAP, and these are different bases of accounting, for sure. But I think in this case it is informative. But so we've got this confluence of accounting questions, legal questions, and whether there's any prior treatment, and and then again, the unique circumstances we're under, which is why, again, this will be ultimately a regulatory determination. And I think, and also we want to be clear, and I think Mr. Capozzi's done a good job sort of separating out some very key issues here about accounting and carrying costs. And so I think this is where we're going to really, where we really would benefit from some further information from you. So thank you.
Can I just ask a clarifying question for the record? And that is, during the discussion we just had with ES SFP 6 column I, Commissioner Beecher asked the panel a number of questions. Do you want any further computations or calculations in a late file?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'd like for late file 31 to amend, is that appropriate? Amend the update to include a column with carrying costs at the weighted average cost of debt. And then the alternative method that you were suggesting, Mr. Horton, it was just sort of a modified version of that, I believe. I didn't know how you described it, but.
It would be reflecting the prime interest rate.
There you go. Thank you. Thanks for that.
You'll see there, there's an ADIT calculation. So in that instance, the department does not apply ADIT. It is applied to the gross balance.
Right. And I'm glad you reminded me of that, because that's one of the reasons I bring it up, because if it's at debt, doesn't the income tax problem go away?
Yeah, so I think you're totally right. So exactly.
And that's good for rate.
So in other words, if like we're calculating the weighted average cost of capital or return at the weight back, and when you do that, ADIT is deducted because it's a rate-based creature.
Exactly. It's a gross up
Exactly.
necessity. And wouldn't that be good for ratepayers not to have to also pay taxes
So
in addition to carrying?
I'm sorry. So, okay, so the gross up goes away, but what I'm saying is if you look at this exhibit here,
Yeah.
and we can spell this out in the response, but you'll see we're applying the weighted cost of capital to the net balance of storm costs net of the accumulated deferred income tax benefit. So there's a reduction, and that's appropriate when you're applying the weighted cost of capital. But the department's practice, and in my experience, just in rate making generally, prior to Pura's change of practice and process, is to, when you're applying a carrying charge other than the WAC, you do it to the other underlying balance, not net of ADIT, because it's not a rate-based creature at that point in time. It's just a representative carrying charge. Rate base is the company's cost. It's the company's rate base. It's the amount that's the company has financed. And so it's
Rate base is recognized by us. It's our construct.
It's your construct, and you apply WAC to rate base.
Correct.
When you apply something other than WAC, it's not to rate base, is I guess all I'm saying. So when we see this calculation, we won't see the ADIT being netted out,
Thank you.
certainly.
Quick question. Just quickly, so LFE 31, I added, please also include columns showing carrying costs calculated at the weighted average cost of debt and the prime rate.
Yes.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Just a quick narrow question. You mentioned Massachusetts uses the prime rate, and I presume that's because it's readily available, published in the journal. You can ask the Fed whatever you want. Could you not also use like the A1P1 commercial paper rate, which would be closer to your true issuance cost, maybe grossed up for backup line standby fees or something?
Mr. Fallon can speak to that, but I think again, if we're talking about if we're trying to get a cost that's reflective of the company's cost of debt, a commercial paper cost, it wouldn't, I don't think, be appropriate or applicable when we're talking about something that's recovered over such an extended period of time. Again, we cannot just rely solely on our commercial paper capacity to finance $1 billion for the reasons that I talked about before. So I think it really depends on, and this is what I would say too, we know that we're asking for carrying charges for all the reasons that I said. And in the end, it is, as Commissioner Beecher just said, it's going to be Pura's decision. Pura is going to need to make an assessment and a determination. We've certainly submitted evidence defending and supporting our recovery of the weighted average cost of capital. To this point, parties have not submitted any other evidence, but Pura will need to make a decision. And one thing that we've seen over time and through the decisions that have come out from the court is that decision will need to be rationalized and justified. And I expect that this commission certainly will, but my point being that there's going to need to be an explanation as to what that carrying charge rate is that's applied, if it's some policy decision, if it's something, or if Pura were to decide that whatever it's going to decide on carrying charges. All I'm trying to get to is if we're going to point to a specific, the references that you just said. I think it will need to be tethered to, well, why is that the appropriate rate to apply other than something else? And that would be true for the prime, that would be true for our WACC, that would be true for our weighted cost of debt. Any of these things, I think that's something else that, we'd expect to see in the decision, certainly. Just the rationale for why one is appropriate versus another.
Okay, thanks.
If I could, I just wanted to add one comment, Commissioner Smith, in terms of commercial paper, that is really the temporary financing, right? That it is then longer term finance. So, from my perspective, that's what something like an unanticipated storm cost that was not budgeted would be initially financed with initially, right? But as commercial paper, as you know, right? I mean, that is a daily, right? Or a, perhaps weekly issuance, which is then financed longer term. So as Mr. Horton explained, these costs clearly needed to be financed longer term.
So thank you. So actually it was a relatively good segue because I wanted to talk about the company's testimony on page 54 of 78, where they begin to discuss the framework for deferred costs in Massachusetts, which I know was just a subject of discussion.
Okay, I'm there.
So let me get my questions. So the other day I began to ask the prior panel about the storm cost deferral threshold, and I see here that Massachusetts has a relatively low threshold of 1.5 million. I presume that captures a lot of storms and maybe relatively more so than would in Connecticut. So my question is, what was the reasoning for, is that a true understanding? Because I'm not familiar with the Massachusetts service territory, so I don't exactly know what the 1.5 million means. But is that a reasonable understanding? And if so, what were the factors weighing in favor of setting that threshold at that level? Do you know?
I do. I know, but just, I guess, for clarity of the record, I'm seeing 1.3. I actually don't recall if it's up to, well, let me just talk about the 1.3 is referenced on that page. It might be 1.5, but so the storm fund in Massachusetts was established back, I think in the early 2000s, it might have been prior. And at that time, my recollection is that the threshold was set at $800,000. There are some critical differences between Connecticut and Massachusetts. I think the key difference when you look at that threshold and compare it to our 4 million threshold is that here PURA has authorized the pre-staging mechanism. Massachusetts doesn't have a pre-staging mechanism. And so that's one difference. Another is that in Connecticut, we have a threshold that once we hit, the costs are allowed for recovery, whereas in Massachusetts, there's a concept of a deductible where only certain of those deductibles are reflected in base rate. So if you hit the threshold, you don't get to recover the amount that has been incurred up to that threshold. So, but I think the key fundamental difference is that it's, like I said, we in Massachusetts don't have the pre-staging framework, so the balance is lower. That threshold, whether it's at 1.3 or 1.5 or 4, like here, what ends up happening in a rate case, which will be another discussion topic for sure in the rate case, is just how much is the level of non-catastrophic storms that are reflected in rates. And I don't mean to anticipate your question.
You did.
Okay. So do you want to just keep going, or do you want me to let you ask it?
No, I'll ask it. So my questions are getting around what, from a rate making perspective, what are the trade-offs for setting for, and I was asking this of the panel yesterday, sort of asking about increasing the storm cost threshold up from 4 million. So what are the rate making trade-offs for having more storms be deemed not catastrophic or non-catastrophic? What are the trade-offs under consideration for that, for doing something like that?
Yep. Great question. So the trade-offs, as I see it, are a couple. Most notably, though, I think the most direct impact is that for storms that occur that are under that threshold, whatever you want to set that threshold at, then those storms would, if you're taking just a pure, rate-making wonk like myself approach, would be to put those storms at a representative level in base rates. So in an extreme example, if we were to say, well, the $4 million is too low, let's increase it to 20. Well, that would mean that any storm that materializes less than 20 would need to be reflected in base rates. That's going to be really hard to do and really hard to get right for customers or for the company. And so that's why that threshold is so important. But the distinction, the trade-off is that whatever amount is below that threshold should be covered in base rates. So in Massachusetts, I think I started to say, my recollection is that the balance started decades ago at $800,000. In rate cases, it's been increased. And then in Massachusetts, the framework is that we have a performance-based rate making mechanism in place that adjusts rates between rate periods. So that threshold now increases and changes in alignment with that PBR framework, which makes sense to me, because when we set base rates, we snap the chalk line, we've got that trade-off. If it's at above 1.3, we're going to get to defer it. If it's below 1.3, it's in base rates. We come out of the rate case, we have PBR adjustments that change our base rates annually and increase them. So those two things are tied to one another. I keep using the word tethered just coincidentally, but they're tethered. It's to say that if the base rate is increasing, we should also increase the threshold, because otherwise we would be being able to defer a cost that someone could argue is actually reflected in base rates for a storm that would be subject to ebb and flow. So to me, those two things have to happen together. It wouldn't be appropriate to now go back and try to adjust the 4 million when we've not had that rate-making paradigm. But I would argue, depending on what happens in the rate case, it certainly may be appropriate. And that's something that we're looking at in our rate case proposal as well. And again, it's expected to be discussed at length.
Thank you. Does increasing the deferred storm cost threshold, does that introduce risk to the company in terms of under recovery of storms? So essentially moving more and higher cost storms into sort of traditional O&M expense? Does that increase risk to the company of under recovery?
I think if it's done right, then it would increase risk to the company and to our customers. Because if we just use an extreme example, and I think it just makes it easier for me if we use an extreme example to see. So if we're going to go, let's just say from $4 million up to $50 million. And that would mean that when we set base rates, again, if we're doing it right, we're going to have to figure out how many storms happened or will happen in a given rate year that are less than $50 million. We're going to have to put that into base rate. So if we were to, let's say we've got, let's say that says that, okay, if we have a 4 million threshold, yes, we're deferring a lot. We're deferring storms that are over that threshold. So the balance is significant. But if we increase the balance to the threshold to 50 million, and now we say we've got to figure out how many storms are going to happen that are less than 50 million, and we've got to put that into base rates every single year. And let's say that amounts to $100 million. We've deferred $100 million because it exceeded 4. But now if we're going to increase the threshold to 50, now we have to put that into base rates. I was looking at Ms. Kimball to see if I'm talking too fast. But so that goes into base rates. So now there's risk on both sides to the company. What was the number I just said, $100 million? We could put $100 million into base rates. So now let's say we have 10 storms that are $40 million. So we've incurred $400 million in a year. Like, we're sunk as a company. But let's say we had none. Customers now have to pay $100 million for storms that just didn't happen. So it's a trade-off, and it's not necessarily one way or the other. I think it depends on how you put that amount into rates, and then reasonable people are going to argue and disagree over who's better off. But at least with keeping the threshold the same at a level that's commensurate with essentially, like, what is a catastrophic storm? What is the level of storms that we just can't try to get right in base rates at a representative level? That's what that amount should stand for. And I think if it were just $4 million and we didn't have the pre-staging framework, I think that would be problematic. I think we'd have a hard time getting that right. You could have materially financial ramifications to the company or to its customers if it were at that level, meaning we would have a lot of storms that aren't subject to that special treatment that's appropriate given their infrequency and volatility of the catastrophic storms.
Okay. In Massachusetts, it looks so, I think you had mentioned this, Mr. Horton, in Massachusetts, and I actually had a clarifying question because in the testimony, I wasn't quite sure. Let me find my question that I understood it. I wasn't quite sure that I understood it. So let me, here we go. Actually, okay, no, before I ask that. So Massachusetts, I thought I read in the testimony, so it's starting on page 54. I wasn't sure exactly where this is. I don't have it in my notes, but it looks like Massachusetts allows a 31 million per year reserve accrual. Does that sound right?
Yes.
Okay, can you put that into perspective for someone from Connecticut? Meaning, I'm just not familiar with the Massachusetts service territory and storms there, so I don't know what 31 million per year means, really.
Okay, so, from a number of customers served perspective, it's roughly.
Or storm costs incurred, like where that level is in terms of annual storm costs incurred, things like that, yeah.
Okay, I mean, I think, so the N-Star Electric service territory and CL&P service territory from a number of metrics are going to be roughly comparable. I don't know offhand if I could compare the annual level of storm costs. If you give me 1 minute, actually, let me try to pull something up.
Okay.
Just 1 second.
As Mr. Horton's pulling that up, just to go back to, I think, some of the comments we heard from the operations panel over the past few days, I think a lot of that, and I'm certainly not to comment on this, but a lot of that can depend too on the weather. I remember Mr. Sullivan, I think on either Tuesday or Wednesday, highlighting a more recent storm where the forecasts were very similar between Connecticut and Massachusetts, and there was a much more much higher impact in Massachusetts than there was in Connecticut, just based on the trajectory of the overall storm. So, I think, that some of it could be, there's a variety of factors that play into that, as well as Mr. Horton's still looking through just the comparisons between Connecticut and Massachusetts.
And I was going to say, maybe I can refer that question to the panel that returns on next week, the operations panel. And maybe I can ask just some more fundamental questions. So in Connecticut, right now in base rates, we have, how much is in base rates? There's kind of two things in base rates. Let me know if I'm correct. There's two things in base rates. There's sort of like a baseline level of reserve accrual, and then there's expired regulatory assets that are also used now as a reserve accrual. Is that correct?
Yes.
And what level is that's currently in base rates as of, this year?
So there's $3 million for a reserve for pre-staging, plus $3 million for a reserve for catastrophic storms, plus approximately $54 million for storms that have been fully recovered and are still reflected in rates. So to the question, just to try to get in apples to apples, if you will, the Massachusetts $31 million would be equivalent to the $6 million as being the sum of the 3 and the 3, or maybe even one could argue it's really the equivalent of the $3 million associated with the catastrophic storms.
But from a practical perspective, it's equivalent to the 60 million?
At this, you're saying in terms of if you look at the total amount in base rates, yeah. I just meant in terms of how an amount that was deliberately set in base rates to reflect the storm reserve funding. That's what I meant by equivalent, but yes,
Understood.
functionally at this point,
Okay.
60 to 31.
Understood. Okay. Yeah, and so maybe if it's appropriate, I can ask the operations panel what 31 million looks like for, the relative to the storm costs incurred in Massachusetts.
And
I'm happy to have you respond, but I'm also happy to defer the question.
no, I mean, I can speak to it as best I can, and then I know that we could provide additional analysis in a late filed if you're so inclined. But what I would say, I'm looking at our internal accounting for storms in Massachusetts, and it's going to vary. I mean, as compared to Connecticut. So already in 26 in Massachusetts, we've incurred $90 million, mostly associated with that one large event that we were fortunate to miss here in Connecticut. Whereas in Connecticut, we've incurred close to 43, so roughly half. Connecticut just year to date today. But that's really just a function of the weather. If you look at 2025, Connecticut versus Massachusetts, Massachusetts lucked out and had several smaller events, such that I can't do this math because it's in a PDF, but it looks like Massachusetts perhaps had maybe close to that $31 million in 2025, whereas in Connecticut, we had, looks like over $150 million in 2025. But then jump back to 2024, Massachusetts had back to over $100 million, which looks like in Connecticut, that same comparison was closer to maybe no, I'm sorry. It looks like it was also comparable. So that is a lot of confusing numbers. The bottom line, I would say, is it's going to be, I would expect it to be roughly equivalent due to the size in the service territory. But I think, Mr. Sullivan in the prior panel did talk about some influences and factors that exist here in Connecticut, regulatory circumstances and legislative requirements that have affected, the costs that we're evaluating here today. That it's a different paradigm in Massachusetts. But I think I'd have to go back farther and look at, how does it compare annually year to year?
Okay, I don't think that's necessary. I think, but back to the Massachusetts paradigm, I got a little lost. So on pages 55 and 56, the company outlines a component or a function they have in their paradigm, which is called the storm cost recovery adjustment factor.
Yes.
Okay, unfortunately named SCRAF. I don't know, I hope nobody calls it that. But I got a little lost on how that works.
I think it was in lieu of a storm cost adjustment mechanism, which would be a scam, so.
Yeah, even worse, okay. Can always get worse, right, I guess?
Rate-making humor.
Yeah. If, there's a 30 million, so there's a reserve accrual of 31 million. If either the accrual, if we have an over recovery of accrual of 30 million or an under recovery of 30 million, then that triggers a review and a reconciliation. Is that how that works, or?
I think it's if the storm reserve balance gets over recovered or under recovered by greater than $30 million, then it would trigger a rate adjustment.
Okay.
And if it's meaning if we're over recovered, we'd give the money back.
Right.
Unfortunately, that's never happened, but that's how that was designed, because the $31 million was in theory supposed to be reflecting the expectation of storm costs that qualify in any given year. That's how the 31 million was derived. We looked at our average historical experience, we removed outliers, and then we tried to put that into base rates.
Okay.
And so if we got over recovered, we'd give it back.
Okay, but each year, regardless of that level, each year storm costs are reviewed for prudency? Is that what happens?
No, it's a little different. It's a great question, though. On its face, that is what's described. It says that if that balance gets out of alignment one way or the other, then a process can happen. But really what happens is that if the process is under recovered, we have the opportunity to file. But historically, generally what's been happening, and Mr. O'Brien can supplement, is that it's for individual events that are significant and large, exogenous events. The department has utilized that exogenous factor to say, well, let's take special attention to address those in a separate proceeding contemporaneously. So we're not having these huge storms drive a major under recovery. Let's look at those and try to let the mechanism work for the annually, I guess, recurring significant events. Sort of how it's worked in practice.
Yeah, and just to add on, I think those exogenous events, I think the threshold typically there is around $30 million. And so if there's an individual storm that's in excess of that, typically we'll go through a process to evaluate and go through the rate case, or to then put that into rates and begin that recovery over typically a 5-year amortization period.
Okay. Okay. Okay, I think that's all the questions I have for that. Although, wait, so prudence reviews only would happen in those instances? Is that correct? When that's triggered and you have that separate review?
In general, those are happening annually. We're on a cadence of filing for storm reviews effectively annually at this point.
Okay. Because that 30 million was triggered?
That's right.
Okay. Okay. And my last set of questions, I want to make sure I understand the company's proposal for securitization. So the company's proposing to securitize the full balance of 2018 to 2023 storm costs, inclusive of the company's carrying cost calculation, which is approximately 1.42 billion. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And the company's proposing to use, because we just spoke about the reserve accruals, the company's proposing to use all customer contributions to that reserve accrual, all customer contributions basically from 2018 to apply to post-2023 storms.
That's right.
Okay. And those would be inclusive of carrying costs as well.
That's right.
Okay. Okay. Did the company do some kind of financial analysis to say, hey, this would save the most amount of cost by just securitizing this whole 1.4 billion?
We talked about that. We can produce that analysis, but I don't know that we went too far because just on its face, it will be the most beneficial for customers because of the fact that securitization as a financing vehicle is the lowest cost option available to us, and it has the minimal bill impact for customers. So that's why we said, hey, let's utilize that tool to the maximum extent possible, and let's keep the balance that customers have paid, recognizing the carrying charges to offset costs that can't be securitized either because of just where we are in time, practically speaking. It would take too long to get through a prudency review of storms that have not yet been filed, or the law, which has a time bar.
Okay. So we have, I'm trying to find my notes where I wrote down the numbers, but there are, so the customer contributions, let me pull up the exhibit. I believe it's SFP 2? Yes, no, SFP 6. Yeah, that's right.
Page 2.
Yeah, page 2. So these are the customer contributions through, from 2018 through to June 2027. That's correct?
Yes,
So inclusive of the company's calculation of carrying charges, that's about 335 million. That's correct?
correct.
So, in the storm costs, I had done the math and I put it somewhere, I can't find it in my notes. The storm costs post, do you have that number off the top of your head? Storm costs post 2023?
We did talk about it in the testimony, so let me just get to that
Okay.
page.
Actually, I think I found it myself.
Okay, yeah, it's
I'll
on
let
page
you-
70-ish.
Yeah. And actually, I calculated them from SFP 2. No. Yeah. No, from SFP, yeah, SFP 2.
I calculated these myself, so this can be subject to check, but I calculated from 24, what's recorded in SFP2. I have storms for 24 through 25 of 213 million without carrying charges. I don't think I did the math on the carrying charges. You probably have that in the testimony.
I'm sorry, did you say 213?
Yeah, of
Yeah.
just storm accrued costs.
You have that right. Yep, that's
Okay.
what we have on, yeah, page
Okay.
70.
And the other number, customer contributions with carrying charges was,
Oh, okay, so customer contributions with carrying charges projected through
Yeah.
June of 27 was 335 million.
do you have the full number of storm costs projected with carrying charges through 2027 of
I-
just 24, 25 storms?
We put it in the testimony. I don't, well, it's in pieces because we did provide the full storm balance. So we described it in testimony. We could certainly produce the exhibit that zooms in on 24 and 25.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just looking for really, at this point, just high level comparison of numbers. And so, because there's also 60 million in base rates accrual that would also apply for 2026 through June 2027,
Well, that's reflected in that,
customer contributions.
it is.
Okay.
That's what's.
That's right.
That's right. That's where the page 2 of SFP 6, it's projecting the $60 million going forward as well as carrying charges accruing on that.
That's right. What I meant to add is the company also has a request for 100 million through RAM of storm cost contribution. That's right.
That's right.
Okay, so that in addition to that, and the company would propose to use that for,
So I know exactly where you're heading, and it is in the testimony, and I'm just trying to see if I could summarize it more succinctly than I typically do. But basically, if you look at that testimony there on page 70,
Mhm.
what we're showing is that it will depend on the rate of storms, from today through when we securitize. But we're estimating that there will be storm costs not securitized in this docket, right, of, oh, I just lost it. 472 million as of June 1st of 2027, which is 252 million for the storms that occurred in 24 and 2025. So it's the amount that you said inclusive of carrying charges through that date, plus another $220 million of anticipated storm activity for 26 and 27. So that's unknown, but if that
And
happens,
that was based on, you just determined that number based on historical averages essentially for.
that's right, 150 million a year,
Okay.
as compared to $335 million of traditional, standard run rate if Pura were to do nothing, which thankfully, from my perspective, yesterday Pura authorized a replenishment of $100 million in the draft decision in the RAM. So if we take that $335 million of recovery, add to it $100 million of additional recovery, that would get us to $435 million. You compare that 435 to the 472 of costs, and then customers would be effectively, made neutral to storms, where we'd not have a balance going forward. So that's why we're proposing that.
Yeah. And those costs would be, some of those storm costs would be subject to a prudence review in the rate case.
That's right.
Some might not because those are,
Some of those costs would not,
Right.
definitely not,
Yeah.
because we're in that balance, we're projecting through the date of securitization.
Okay.
So, and again, we're looking at it as a way to reset, and Pura may look at it differently. We're looking at it as a way to reset, to clear the balance, to leverage this phenomenal tool in securitization as to the greatest capacity possible, and then to reset for customers so we just start fresh in the rate case. Yes, prudency reviews will need to happen. I hope we get in a more frequent cadence there, but that's a future determination. From just a dollars perspective, customers would then start fresh.
yeah, and any costs deemed imprudent would be returned to customers with carrying charges.
Exactly.
Okay. I think that covers all the questions I have. So I want to thank the panel very much and thank you, commissioners.
Thank you.
Just a quick question. Out of curiosity, do you view securitization as a one-time tool that's used to clean up sort of the problems or sins of the past? Or do you view it as a tool that would perhaps be used again in the future?
It's an excellent question. Securitization is used rarely. my personal perspective is that if we could use it for storm costs, not that I ever want to be in this position again, but if we had an out, it's really effective when you have a large one-time cost like storms that customers are going to need to pay over an amortized period of time. In that scenario, you have securitization is the way to go. It's the best way for customers. So we either need to fashion a framework that gets us so that we're not in that position again, and that's what we'll be proposing in the rate case, by having rates change more contemporaneous to the costs, or you need to be, able to utilize a tool like that, which requires legislative authorization, or you need to be okay with the ramifications of not having that, which would be more traditional rate recovery, which has greater bill impacts and the need for more carrying charges. So I think it's a tool that's very effective for one-time types of costs, not always, though, just for the sins of the past. I mean, utilities across the country have used securitization more and more frequently for storms. We've seen that. And, we've been advocating for securitization to be utilized as a tool since 2020. And thankfully, this past session, again, with the support of the OCC and others, it's now available to us. It would be great if over time, the state got comfortable that it is an effective tool and maybe increase that authorization, or in the rate case, we come up with a framework that just makes it less likely we need it. But that's what I would say about securitization.
All right, so does that complete Pura staff's cross?
It does. Thank you.
Okay. We're almost at the lunch break, but I just want to check. It might be possible. No one else has reserved cross, so I'm just going to cycle through the parties quickly to see if hold on, let me actually pull up the agenda again before I run into trouble like I did last time. Yes, I was right. So I'm just going to run through the parties and ask for cross really quick. And then if anyone does have cross, maybe we can figure out whether we'll take a break before we even start. EOE. Okay. OCC. Attorney General. Okay. And Deep. No questions. Okay. Yes. Okay. Attorney Pace. Well, maybe this is a little. Well, are you considering redirect for this panel?
We do, because we covered so many important topics over the hour and 50 minutes. We would like to bring this panel back after lunch with your permission to do redirect examination. But I do have a question for the commissioners, and that would be for the customer panel who I have here. Nobody has reserved the right to cross-examination. If that's true, with your permission, we could use the 10 minutes to actually bring them up here, swear them in, they can adopt their testimony. And if there are no questions, with your permission, they could be excused.
You read my mind. I feel very smart because I think you're smart. So the fact that I was thinking the same thing means that I must be smart today. You read my mind. I was going to ask. So I was going to suggest a little unorthodox, but just going around again, asking if anyone has changed their mind with respect to their reservation of cross. If no one has, maybe we can just seat that panel, swear them in, they can adopt, we can break for lunch, and then we can come back for redirect for this panel.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So for the customer panel on page 6 of the agenda, Pura staff, do we have any cross?
We do not.
Okay. EOE? Okay. OCC? Attorney General's office? And Deep. Okay. So why don't we, for the record, no one, I know doesn't get picked up on audio, every party's confirmed they do not have cross for that panel. So why don't we seat that panel, introduce them, swear them in, adopt, and then we'll break for lunch.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Chairman, by looking at the panel, we have all of our 10 witnesses seated either at the table or in the row behind them. And so with your permission, I can have them just identify their names and titles for the record before you administer the oath.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. Starting with Mr. McGrath, could you please identify your name and title for the record?
Certainly. Good morning. My name is Tim McGrath. I'm the Director of the Contact Centers at Eversource Energy.
Megan Bernardini, Director of Customer Communications for Eversource.
Elizabeth Jones, Director of Customer Digital and Technology Strategy.
Good morning. David Coco, Director of IT Business Solutions for Eversource Energy.
Good morning. Jeffrey Pugliese, Director of Community Relations for Eversource in Connecticut.
And for the remaining witnesses who appear in the back row, could you please stand in a loud, clear voice and identify your name and title for the record?
Director, Voice of the Customer, and Customer Experience Strategy. For anybody,
Stacy Pepin, Contact Center. Care Concierge.
Morning, Sean Brady, Manager of Customer Training.
And that's the entire panel. It's 10 witnesses, Chairman.
Thank you very much. If the panel will raise your right hand, I will administer the oath as set forth in General Statute Section 125. Do you solemnly swear or solemnly and sincerely affirm, as the case may be, that the evidence you shall give concerning this case shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God, or upon penalty of perjury? Thank you. That panel is sworn.
So for the witness panel, in order to be efficient with the approach I used earlier this morning, I'm going to ask you to answer in unison to the following questions. So did each of you sponsor in connection with this proceeding either pre-filed testimony or interrogatories?
Yes.
And does any witness have any modifications at this time? And do each of you adopt those materials as your sworn testimony under oath? And with that, Chairman, they've completed their adoption. We have nothing further for this panel.
Thank you very much. So this panel is dismissed, and we will break for lunch, and we will return back to redirect panel 2 for redirect after the lunch break, and we'll break until 1 o'clock. Thank you. Okay, welcome back. We are back on the record in docket 25-12-13, and we are back to the second panel in the agenda for redirect. So if you're ready, Attorney Pace, you can go right ahead.
We're going to have Attorney Kimball provide the redirect.
Thank you. Somebody fix the microphone. It's great. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to start here with Mr. Horton. When the company uses the word compensatory in relation to carrying charges, what are you trying to convey there?
Yeah, so what we're trying to convey is really two things. One is recognizing that there was a cost that has been incurred, and then number two would be some recognition in rates for recovery of that cost. And I think we used the word when we look back at the prior practice of PURA with the rate-based treatment, and we describe it as compensatory. You know, that's a word that I don't typically use in rate making, where we're talking about something that's dollar for dollar recovery. It's a tracker. It's at a representative level. We're using compensatory because it's different. And really what I'm trying to reflect by using that word is that method recognized that it was not providing for fixed dollar for dollar recovery to the question I think that was asked. It's setting a level in base rates, and it's therefore compensating us not only for the going forward carrying charges, but also that which had been incurred up to that point. And compensatory could mean different things. It could be devised in different ways. To Commissioner Beecher's question, I think there's ways that a regulator can establish what would be a compensatory sharing, an appropriate sharing of risk between what a company has incurred and what a company is allowed to collect. Particularly in things like this, storm cost recovery, you know, we certainly have full expectation of getting dollar for dollar recovery of the costs that we incurred. I say that because that's our experience in other states as it relates to the underlying cost. But for carrying charges, I know that there needs to be a sharing of risk. So in Massachusetts, it devised its, I would say, compensatory framework in a way that acknowledges back to the date that the cost was incurred, but not at the company's weighted average cost of capital, but as some other proxy for that. Or it could be the weighted average cost of capital, but from the date of prudence in going forward. And Commissioner Beecher, I see that so I'll stop.
I did not want
Right.
to interrupt. Thank you. So often the term compensatory refers to a rate of return that is set at the cost of capital without any risk, or without, I should say, any additional like return premium that you might see under a regulatory framework. So in other words, it's strictly at the cost of capital. You know, so is that what you're also referring to?
Well, I'm not sure. I think if I understand the question, I think what I'm saying is that from our perspective and what we have shown with the evidence in the record is that we have incurred our weighted cost of capital to finance this regulatory asset. We've had to finance it with debt and equity, and the cost of our equity is our return on equity. But what I'm saying is that a regulator is able to establish a level for recovery of deferred assets.
Yeah.
You know, a regulator, of course, has the ability to establish a framework that it feels balances the risk between the company and its customers, so that, you know, we're not expecting that a regulatory framework is in all cases going to provide us dollar for dollar recovery of every dollar spent and our full weighted cost of capital. That's just not how rate making works.
Yeah.
You know, but here, you know,
But your cost of capital is not the same as your cost of equity is not the same as your return on equity. Would you agree?
well, I think I'm not sure. Could you elaborate before I just ramble?
Well, the markets, weigh in here, right, on
Sure.
the cost of equity. Regulators don't set the cost of equity. We set a return on equity based on what we think is fair and provide you a reasonable opportunity to earn it. So they're really different concepts. So I'm just trying to get it, you know, cost of equity, and going back to your point, whether you can demonstrate that in this record that is actually, or you know, how you actually have been carrying this literally, not theoretically.
Yes, and absolutely. And I think that we can demonstrate that. And we can demonstrate that by talking about, and Mr. Fallon can chime in, you know, how CLMP as an entity, where does it get its capital resources to finance our obligations? You know, we have, and Mr. Fallon can speak to that. But to your point, the cost of equity is different from our return on equity, the level that's set in rates. And two things I would say is, number one, Eversource as an entity, our cost of equity has gone significantly higher because of the regulatory environment predominantly here in Connecticut. That's caused the investors to evaluate Eversource as a whole and run away from it as an investment because of, in large part at least, the Connecticut regulatory environment. So our cost of equity has gone up. But from a CLMP perspective, the return on equity that is set in rates as well has been significantly deflated by the fact that we have had significant and growing balances of storm costs. Our earned return on equity has been hundreds of basis points below our authorized return on equity and plummeting as the storm balances have increased. Frankly, and predominantly because we've had to finance these storm costs. We've had to finance them with debt and with equity, such that we have not had any recognition in rates of these costs, but our equity balances had to grow to finance these costs. And maybe Mr. Fallon could talk about, just to your question, like how does CLMP finance its?
Sure, but before we leave that, but the storm costs are not the only driver of your risk profile. Would you agree?
I would, and it's also, and I'm not even talking about the risk profile as much. And there's a lot, when I mentioned the cost of equity, I suppose that I was. But you're right, there's a lot of things that happen. We did put in an exhibit in the testimony that talked about, what are the things that have driven individual components in for CLMP that have driven in storm costs was one, regulatory deferrals was one, also the RAM fluctuations and over under recoveries was another, our construction work in progress. So there we were making the point that, look, our short-term debt capacity is only available to fund a finite number of things. To make the point, I think, to what you're saying is that to demonstrate to PURA that we've had to rely on certainly more than short-term debt to finance our storm costs. We've had to. It's limited. CLMP has an ability to borrow $600 million. We talked about that. But even Eversource as a whole, we have a $2 billion commercial paper program. We need to maintain liquidity to finance as a company the $500 million of storms that we experience across our service territory. And so the point is that we have had to rely, we can only rely to a certain extent and in the short term on our short-term debt borrowing. We put that in to make exactly the point that you're asking me about. How can we demonstrate to PURA that we've had to rely on our costs of long-term debt and our equity to finance these under recoveries for storms? We've had to, because we can't just rely on any one funding source. So that's why we get to, from our perspective, the cost is our weighted cost of capital. And that's why we're put that onto the record. But it is certainly within PURA's realm to devise a different framework. And this is exactly the question that you're asking and what you're grappling with. And I totally I don't know how you get there, but I do think it's going to be within this decision. I certainly expect that PURA will have to answer the question of, well, what's appropriate for the company to recover? Is there some other way to recognize that we've incurred that cost? You've asked us questions about, well, what would it look like if you calculated back on the prime? And I guess that's what I was saying to Ms. Kimball's first question, what's compensatory? We've put in a dollar for dollar recovery at the weighted cost of capital. And I'm not stupid enough to think that PURA is going to just authorize that blindly, although I don't see there's any other evidence combating that we've incurred that cost. There's very good questions, but there is no other evidence on this record. So PURA is going to have to wrestle with that in the final decision. It's going to have to explain how it comes to a conclusion around, well, what is appropriate and fair to compensate the company? And I think, we've put on the record to show what our weighted cost of capital is, but that's where I say too, there's other ways that regulators can compensate the utility while sharing the risk between the utility and its customers going back in time. And it doesn't necessarily need to be the full weighted cost of capital. In Massachusetts, they give you recognition back to the date the costs were incurred, but at a cost that's less than our weighted cost of capital. In Connecticut, it used to be that we would rely on our full weighted cost of capital from the date of the prudency forward determination and forward. In this proceeding, and I know no one wants to be picking scabs, I certainly don't want to. It's been a wonderful day, but this was a tough environment for the last 6 years. And we tried repeatedly to get PURA to evaluate these costs for prudence when we were operating under a framework that was explicit from the date of prudence and forward, the company shall get recognition of carrying charges. We tried repeatedly, and we put onto the record all the games that were played to extend the schedule and to delay and never get to a prudence determination. And I honestly believe it was because of exactly that PURA knew that when you get to a prudency determination, we will be able to recover carrying charges from that point and forward. So what motivation does PURA have to issue a decision on carrying charges if under a regime that is doing everything it can to deny the utility its ability to recover its costs, including its carrying charges? There was a lot going on. It was a very toxic environment. And so we were harmed. And now we are having to ask for this commission to evaluate the extent that that harm was applicable during that period, given all the changing circumstances. And that's why we are here.
Appreciate that. And you do understand, we are here to consider this and move forward. That's you know, we're cognizant. And there's another little qualitative issue I've had on my mind, and that is, you know, when a return on equity on what are essentially force majeure, right? These are events of nature. You know, it raises some interesting theoretical and policy questions around, you know, profiting from very unfortunate events that cause people a lot of pain. And so I just throw that out there as another rationale for why we all need to really work hard to think about what's just and reasonable here in that context. Because this, again, I keep coming back to the uniqueness of this particular regulatory asset in the situation. And I believe your colleague was, or you may want to answer that. I don't know, or respond. But
Yeah, no, I just wanted to offer just a couple of thoughts. I mean, in terms of how this, you know, was financed, right? Because it was over a longer term. It was financed through, you know, balance of debt and equity. And so that's why we asked for the WACC as the return to compensate for that financing, which is similar to how we finance the business. I would just offer in terms of, you know, profiting, right? We are actually going out and borrowing money both from debt holders as well as equity holders. So when you look at the ROE, right, that is determined to compensate for that borrowing.
But if I think
no, the ROE is for equity shareholders, and I mean, the ROR is compensating both sets of shareholders, right? Debt and equity.
Right.
So yeah, understand.
Yep.
But Commissioner, I think just to respond, I totally understand and appreciate what you're saying. And two things, which is that in the upcoming rate case, we do, and I mentioned, I fully expect that we will be proposing an alternative framework for discussion in this room and for PURA's ultimate decision that in our perspective would do exactly what you're saying, that a going forward framework would be one that balances that interest. As to your point, Massachusetts authorized the prime rate. I think it's to balance that interest. It's to say that we are not going to establish a framework that provides any perverse incentive, that allows the utility excessive returns, whatever. It's a sharing. That's what I mean by the sharing, effectively. The DPU has established that framework, so that would be part of it too. And I think one thing, this is an awkward position that we're in, and perhaps something I shouldn't say out loud and on the record, but I will. I think that's why in our testimony and sitting here now, we had tried to advance the concept of a settlement to say that we know that there's a lot at play. There's disparate views. PURA is going to have a tough decision to make. So if we could get to a settlement agreement, and Vice Chairman Arconti, trying to make you a Hall of Famer, doing not so well, but you know, there is still time, and I think that the challenge is this is a sticky issue from our perspective, and I'm not trying to pick a scab. We fully, and I full stop, want to turn the page, turn the corner, and move forward. We're not trying to look back, but we have a significant under recovery that we were harmed. We were harmed. And so we have nothing to do here but to try to recoup some of that cost And right now, if we have nothing. So if we could get to a settlement framework, if Pura could send a signal by, and I'm suggesting something perhaps, but if Pura could authorize EOE to lead a settlement discussion, that would send a very strong message to parties to try to come to resolution. Maybe that doesn't happen, but to this point, I think we've not obviously been successful in reaching a settlement. The purpose of a settlement would be that we could work together and try to come to some resolution that will allow us to move forward, that would allow us to get to a place that we can get a decision on the storm costs and on recognition of some compensatory framework, because the prior frameworks have been, taken away or are not adequate, that we could try to get to a resolution and a non-appealable settlement of the issues. That's our preference. In the absence of a settlement agreement, I'm just trying to be as transparent as I can with you all. We're putting on the table the full cost that we have incurred, the full harm that we have experienced and felt as a company. It is ultimately up to you. And I think now you're going to have to, with the evidence in front of you, try to evaluate what we have presented for our costs and strike a balance that's reasonable, that is explained as to why we get what we get and don't get what we don't. And then we'll just have to see if and to what extent, we feel that that's adequate.
Appreciate that. One last technical question, but sort of technical or practical question. Has Eversource ever had any difficult raising capital, ignoring the rate?
So in terms of difficulty raising capital, that's a hard thing to define, right? The question is, if you take a look at where our cost of issuing debt is, it's because we've kept it low because we've managed the business conservatively and we've financed the business conservatively, right? In terms of access to equity capital, it's very clear that our, cost to access equity capital is higher than peers. And there's a number of factors that you referenced, right? Some being regulatory factors and some being, other factors as well.
Okay, but you'd agree that markets will supply capital. The question is, at what rate?
To a certain extent, right? I mean, you tap that well, too much and you're in a very difficult place, right? So, I mean, it comes down to the decisions that are made, right, for regulated utilities can drive the cost of capital increasingly higher.
All right, thank you.
Okay. You at least did that at a good speed. So, all right. But I think I'm going to follow up on a question, this concept of profiting on force majeure. And I would ask you, Mr. Horton, if Pura were to allow WAC on the storm asset, would it be in Eversource's interest to sit back and earn on that regulatory asset or to move forward with securitization? What is the outcome that is better for the company?
To move forward with securitization. And I think that gets to a theory, I think it was on the record, is to suggest that, well, if we could just get, or no, it was in the 220808 decision, there was a notion that utilities, if you could get carrying charges on an asset, that we would be incentivized to then just sit out and let the carrying charges accrue and continue to build. We would never seek recovery, which is far from where utilities need to be. To Mr. Fallon's point just now, like, yes, investors care about earnings. Utility investors nowadays care almost as much or more about the health of our balance sheet, which is a simple way, or I could say it's simpler by saying, we need to get recovery of these dollars. We have $1.5 billion that we financed. We need to get the cash in the door. We have every incentive and motivation to move as quickly as we can to securitize these costs. That is the most efficient financing vehicle that we could do. Yes, upfront, yes, long time, but once we can securitize it, it's the best thing for customers. I've been advocating for it personally since 2020. And so we would have every motivation and incentive to securitize as quickly as we could, period.
Okay, thank you. A little faster. Okay. Would do you recall earlier you were asked by Mr. Capozzi, would the old treatment work, referring to the rate-based treatment? So if we took that hypothetically to mean that some type of cost of recovery of carrying charges was fashioned by just doing that rate base, the alternative, what would it look like if you did it as a rate base? Would you feel that that was compensatory here?
Yes, I do recall that discussion, and that gets to the scab that I know none of us want to pick. I think the answer to that would be yes, if we had our prudency reviews conducted timely. Again, we tried to start this process for the first tranche of storms back in December of 2023. Pura waited until March of 24 to reject it. We had it rejected, immediately refiled it. So it's been over 2 years that we've been trying to have these costs reviewed. We are very grateful for this commission picking it up and acting very expeditiously. The answer to the question is, if we had the prior rate-based treatment and we had the established precedent that prudency determines when carrying charges begin to accrue, such that we would have accrued carrying charges and not had those prudency reviews unfairly delayed, then yes, I would view it as a compensatory framework. It's not the world that we're in at the moment, but that would have been a compensatory framework.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. O'Brien, could you just go back to maybe talk a little bit about, do you recall you were asked questions about the accounting that came out of that decision in 220808? And I was wondering if you could go back and be a little more specific about what you saw as the accounting flaws in that decision.
Sure. So I think it really comes down to two primary things. The first is that a regulatory asset is not determined by PURA in a rate case. A regulatory asset is recorded to the company's books under US GAAP, and more specifically under Accounting Standards Codification, or ASC 980, which is a specific set of accounting guidance that is tailored for regulated entities. And ultimately, that accounting guidance is what allows a company to defer a regulatory asset. And a regulatory asset is ultimately deferred when a company incurs a cost that is probable of recovery. And specific to storms, those costs are deferred on our balance sheet as they are incurred, and the probability of recovery was determined ultimately in the company's last rate case, which allowed the company to defer those costs. And ultimately, in the rate-making arena, it's PURA that determines what component of that regulatory asset on our balance sheet that is ultimately recoverable from customers. And the second point that we touched on a little bit earlier this morning was really in 220808, the GAAP definitions that were used in the distinguishment between an incurred cost and an allowable cost that was used to highlight that carrying costs would only be eligible from the point of prudency forward. And as I mentioned this morning, from a cost incurrence perspective, a debt-based cost is recognized and deferred typically as a regulatory asset when that cost is actually incurred and represents an incurred cost. And it's the return on equity that is recognized at the point of realization.
Is it possible that I add to that? I know the question wasn't to me. The question was about 220808.
Yes, but can I just ask him one more question? to
Yeah,
follow up?
that-
Okay. When you said that the accounting standards recognize the return on equity of the point of realization, is just going back to the previous discussion, are you using return on equity synonymous with earnings?
Yes, I'm referencing the fact that the return on equity would, from a weighted average cost of capital perspective, recognize the earnings component of the weighted average cost of capital, which is separate from the debt component of the weighted average cost of capital.
Okay. So now, do you have further elaboration?
Well, I was going to go back to the 220808 decision and just talk about not only did that decision change the framework that PURA applied, but there was a lot of other things that were changing and happening in real time, to the point that I was talking about a moment ago with Commissioner Beecher, just in terms of what all was happening in Connecticut with PURA. And it is just in the time since most of you have been appointed on the commission, it's a complete sea change. And I think it will be difficult to kind of imagine the world that at least we were operating in at that time. It's very different today. And I mean that not to be, overly gracious and awkward with you all, but just in the, 6 or so technical sessions and hearings that I've been a party to and chairman with your leadership, I think the way that we're engaging didn't ever happen under the prior commission. It was a very difficult environment, and I really appreciate we're in a different spot now. But we have to also realize that in 2023, not only did the UI decision change fundamentally how storm costs were recovered, but there was a lot of other things happening too that we were seeing and was affecting our decision-making in the regulatory process. There was the Aquarion decision that was resulting in credit rating downgrades. There was the UI decision that similarly had a very negative reaction from credit rating agencies in the investment community. There was also a lot of public statements by the former chair of PURA that was talking about tools that could be used in the context of a rate case, particularly against Eversource. It was just a very different environment. So I just say all that to say, not only did the decision in isolation change fundamentally our approach to storms in storm cost recovery, and the way that we were anticipating dealing with that in the context of a rate case, there was just a lot of other things that were happening as well that was opening our eyes to just how tenuous the situation was for us and for regulated utilities in Connecticut.
Okay. So I think I just have a last question here. So, Mr. Fallon, can you go back? Do you recall there was some discussion earlier about planned financing, and whether storm costs are part of the funding plan for the business?
Yes.
Could you please review how the company does plan to cover storm costs?
Sure, absolutely. So, similar to every other cost that we project as we, go into the year, we take a look at what we'd expect for cash in and cash out for our expected financings over the course of the year. In particular, for storms, what we take a look at is, a longer term average, right? Because there can be years where we experience significantly high costs, and there can be years where we have significantly lower storm activity. So we use that as a baseline for our projected storm costs each year.
And then could you explain whether are there funding sources that are directly targeted at covering that cost, or what are those funding sources and how are they accounted for?
So there are no funding sources that are directly targeting a specific component of our costs, right? We're looking at the overall picture, again, of the ins and the outs and, what's anticipated based off of our experience, understanding there's going to be variability. So any variability along with, similar to what our projected gap between what our ins are, which are customer revenues, and our outs are, which are, capital expenditures, et cetera. All of that is financed the same, and that's financed through a balance of debt and equity.
And those sources of debt and equity are what for CLMP?
For CLMP, there's 3 sources of equity, of capital, both debt and equity. The first is retained earnings at CLMP. So that's about 40% of the net income is retained and reinvested into the business. The second would be long-term debt. CLMP issues its own long-term debt that is issued in line with our rate base growth. And then the third is equity contributions from the parent company. So those are the 3 sources of funding for CLMP.
And over the past several years, have there been stresses or strains on CLMP's ability to, or its capacity to support its costs?
At the CLMP level, certainly, because as, you know, as we showed, the cash inflows are significantly lower than the cash outflows. So therefore, the short-term debt at CLMP is not sufficient to cover those cash outflows. One of the major, well, two of the major cash outflows, of course, are these storm costs that we're talking about here. In addition, there was a significant regulatory deferral that also took place in relation to how rates were set to recover our costs of nuclear power contracts. So CLMP, as we demonstrated, has been significantly stressed.
I think that's it. I think that's all we have. Thank you.
Sure. Commissioner Smith has a question. Sure. I mean, yeah, we can ask questions whenever we want.
So I should know the answer to this, but I don't. For the securitization, from a rating agency point of view, do they consider that off-balance sheet non-recourse? Or does that come into account on your ratings?
They do. They consider that off balance sheet. And from an optics perspective, the debt will be on the Eversource balance sheet if Eversource is the issuer. If a state entity is the issuer of the securitization bonds, then it would not be on the Eversource balance sheet. And I know you know what that means in terms of when investors take a look at your balance sheet. It's just, you know, rating agencies understand securitization. Investors will ask about, you know, what is this debt? And so it is, you know, but that's the way it's handled under two scenarios.
Okay. And a broader question is just that putting securitization aside, have you in the past ever looked at any alternative financing arrangements that might involve isolating the storm assets into, say, a SPV and trying to establish a non-recourse 100% debt-backed vehicle in that manner?
I don't know that we have looked at anything like that. I will say that, of course, we look at every financing tool in the toolkit. I'm not aware of that type of vehicle across, you know, peer utilities. So it's not, I mean, something I will add though, just, you know, my experience of seeing how storms are handled in areas where, you know, the Southeast, where you're constantly dealing with hurricanes, or the Gulf. Generally, the way that they've handled those is they try and, you know, build something into rates that can, you know, handle, let's call it a medium level of storm activity. And then, as Mr. Horton said, if there's an event that, you know, is out of the ordinary, a hurricane, tornadoes, et cetera, that's when they'll rely on securitization.
Okay, thanks.
And just to quickly, I promise I'm also not aware of a structure like that. We haven't had a structure like that at Eversource. I'm not aware of one in the industry, although it could exist. The only similar that I can think of is we have in Massachusetts, we had a special project financing arrangement where we had a unique customer that we were able to basically set up a separate entity, construct the infrastructure to serve that customer. And we had a special financing arrangement where it was unique debt issuances for that purpose. Otherwise, though, it's part of the overall corporate entity. You know, that's where we say, you know, you've got to look at the overall capitalization of the business, debt and equity for everything. In the case of that special project financing, you know, that was something that was set up at the time we knew about it. We arranged the financing in advance of the construction. So it's an entirely different vehicle than storm costs that can happen to us at any point in time. Force majeure, we have to respond. And so I'm not aware of it being something that's been set up in that way.
I have, it's actually not a question, it's sort of more of a statement, I guess, but I don't know, I just decided I can do that. I wanted to respond, Mr. Horton, you mentioned settlement and specifically referenced potentially ordering EOE. I just wanted to respond to that in the spirit of being totally transparent. First, I don't think we can do that because EOE is just assigned prosecutor. I can't tell EOE to do anything in this case because they're a party like any other party. I mean, I suppose I could tell OCC the same thing, but I hope you understand, like, I don't think we have that tool in the toolkit here where EOE is completely separate from PURA. Like, I don't feel that I, as the chair, have authority over them to tell them to do anything. I also to be totally transparent, and this isn't argumentative, it's really just explaining at least where I'm personally coming from. There are a couple cases before the Supreme Court right now where the argument has been that EOE's involvement in prior settlement decisions binds PURA as an agency, as a party to the provisions of a settlement agreement. That would be tough for me personally to navigate in a situation. I mean, while that kind of the state of the law there is a little ambiguous from my perspective, like, I don't know. I guess what I'm saying is, if EOE is a party to a settlement, does that mean if EOE agrees to something that none of us are part of, does that mean that we're bound to whatever EOE is bound to? I won't ask legal to respond to that. I'm just saying, and maybe it's appropriate to respond to if there were a settlement before us where that was an issue, but I'm just sort of throwing out there for the sake of transparency. It's just another reason why that's tough. But I say all that not to discourage settlement at all. I think everyone, I don't want to speak for all, I'll try only speaking for myself. I think everyone would be totally receptive to a settlement being proposed to us. I just wanted to say, that's why I don't think you're going to see an order from us directing EOE to do anything in this case. If that makes sense.
I really appreciate that. I think that's the folly with me playing lawyer. I should not, but I just was speaking back to a prior experience where I know that prosecutorial staff, it is different. I think it preceded EOE as an entity, but prosecutorial staff was assigned by PURA in the prior settlement agreement that I was involved with in 2018. And then that was, so but I am not a lawyer, so I totally appreciate that.
Thanks. And again, it wasn't a legal argument. I was like, just in the spirit of transparency, trying to say, like, I hope none of the parties are sort of waiting for us to give that direction, and because I'm just trying to explain that's why we're not going to give it, but if that makes sense. So unless there's any other questions, I think that concludes the hearing for today. And this panel is dismissed, and we will be back on April 1st, where the emergency response plan and storm cost panel on page 2 of the agenda will come back for further cross. And I think, as I indicated earlier in the hearing, we're just going to follow the same order that's currently in the agenda. So EOE would have the opportunity to cross that panel again, followed by OCC, authority staff, Attorney General's office, DEEP, and ultimately the opportunity for redirect. That makes sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Any administrative matters before we break until next week?
We have none. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody, and have a good weekend.
Thank you very much.